Welcome to this evening's highly anticipated talk. As Danielle said, this is a joint effort hosted by the Yellowstone Gateway Museum Foundation in collaboration with our esteemed community partners, Park County Environmental Council, Park County Community Foundation, Elk River Arts and Lectures, and the Tom Miner Basin Association. We are incredibly grateful for their support and commitment to really fostering a deeper understanding of our region's unique heritage and ecosystem. Now, it is with great pleasure that we introduce tonight's distinguished speaker, Dr. Dann Flores. Dr. Flores is the Hammond Professor Emeritus of the History of the American West, a title that only hints at the breadth of his expertise and impact. He is a prolific writer whose works have shed light on how the landscapes of the American West shape the interactions between humans and wildlife. His notable books, which are right outside the door here, including Coyote America, which is a definitive natural and cultural history of the coyote, and American Serengeti, which explores the vast and vibrant life of the Great Plains. These have garnered critical acclaim and inspired readers and scholars alike. His most recent work, Wild New World, has won the prestigious Rachel Carson Award and continues to influence contemporary discussions on environmental and conservation issues. Dr. Flores also lent his expertise to the recent Ken Burns documentary, American Buffalo. Also some images in there from the Yellowstone Gateway Museum. He was able to enhance the narrative with his deep knowledge and passion for the American West. His approach to our historical and ongoing relationship with nature not only enlightens, but also urges us towards a more thoughtful and sustainable interaction with our environment. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Dann Flores to the stage.
So thank you very much, obviously. And the first thing I want to say is it's really good to be back in Montana. It's just as I remembered it. I mean, just as wonderful as ever. So thanks to all of you who I've spent time with since I've been here, for inviting me, as some of you know, a group of us from the museum had a pretty marvelous day in the park today. It's the first time I've been in the park, in fact, in about 5 or 6 years, since before COVID. And so it was, it was without any question a real high point of the visit. And I hope that the evening here is going to be something that that you'll enjoy. What I'm going to do with it, this is going to be a talk out of Wild New World, the newest book of mine. But what I'm going to do with it is to, since we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Endangered Species Act of 1973, which in Wild New World I pretty much regard as the turning point in America's treatment of wildlife, I want to celebrate that by telling you a story that, don't despair, it's going to sound grim for 35 minutes or so, but it does have an upward arc at the end, and I think it'll give you some understanding of how we created so many endangered species and so many creatures that we lost entirely from the North American continent, but also give you a little bit of insight into how it came about that we began to rescue some of our most charismatic animals. And of course, one of those, as you'll see, and as you can tell from the image on the screen, is the gray wolf. So, without any further introduction, let me just commence with this. And I will tell you that this first story and several of the stories I tell, I apologize to the scientists, by the way, usually every time I do a talk, because I was an English major. So I'm really sort of in love with storytelling and character development and things like that. I did go on and get a PhD in history, but my beginnings as a writer were as a writer for magazines as a freelancer. So I've never quite given up this idea of storytelling as an art. And this is a book that's full of stories. I'm going to start it out with one of them. This is the beginning of chapter 9 in Wild New World. In the 1920s, as flappers and jazz and Hollywood captivate American cities, a man named Bill Kaywood is engaged in a different cultural project. At 50, Kaywood is a stocky stump of a man with a face like a granite cliff. He's a professional assassin of wolves, but says he loves the animals he watches die. He's a real fellow, the big gray is. Lots of brains. I feel sorry every time I see one of these big fellows thrashing around in a trap bellowing bloody murder. Kaywood is the sort of American the writer D.H. Lawrence, getting his first extended exposure to this country, will describe as stoic, a killer. And what he's doing is mop-up work. Where the continent only 3 centuries before had easily held 100,000 wolf packs, by the 1920s, few packs remain anywhere in the U.S. outside Alaska, the Great Lakes country, and the lower South. Kaywood is after the last survivors in the West. Few enough animals that ranchers and government hunters hired on their behalf have started giving the animals individual names. They call 2 of these last gray wolves Kaywood is tracking down Rags and Greenhorn. Animals that had once lived in packs, once had mates and pups. Rags and Greenhorn are enduring lives of lonely desperation. Like a significant percentage of gray wolves who turn to livestock, they're too old and frail to bring down elk without a pack's help. Younger wolves who ended up stock killers often had suffered crippling injuries, frequently by losing multiple toes or an entire foot, escaping the serrated jaws of the Newhouse 4.5 steel trap. Rags had seen one of the 2 mates he had had during his lifetime panicked and helpless in a trap. He learned from that and is himself unmaimed. Rags is an old wolf. The ranchers say he's 17 or 18, but he's probably closer to 10 or 11. And now he travels alone. As for Greenhorn, this female wolf, named for a local mountain range near Kaywood's Front Range home, has teeth so worn she's been reduced to strangling her prey. In her past, she's escaped traps and spit out a strychnine bait before he could kill her. When Kaywood goes after her in 1923, the ranchers claim she's 18 years old. Whatever her real age, she is slowly starving to death. These are wolves the federal agency Kaywood works for should leave to die natural deaths. But Rags and Greenhorn live in a nation that cannot brook a single wolf remaining alive anywhere. It's Rags' turn first. Across weeks of time, Kaywood sets his traps and Rags digs them up. With a wolf that smart, the former bounty hunter rigs a trap set designed to snare a wolf by a back leg as it digs up other traps with its front paws. It works. With a trap biting into a rear leg and a second trap sprung on the drag line of the first, bouncing after him on a 3-foot chain, the old wolf spends a final day in tortured flight. In the end, hemmed into a box canyon, he confronts a fate he's escaped for a decade. Purposefully, he limps straight towards Kaywood, yellow eyes fixed and staring as the metal clanks over the rocks behind him. Kaywood stoically shoots the equivalent of an octogenarian wolf in the head. Next, Greenhorn. It's December, cold and snowy on the Front Range, and with her teeth mostly gone, the elderly wolf can't down a deer, let alone a cow. She's desperately hungry. She knows the scent of strychnine, but Kaywood has attracted her with a horse's head wired to a juniper around which he's placed chunks of fat suet soaked in poison. Greenhorn shies away from the smell again and again. She knows from her own experiences and from wolf culture that this scent means danger. She's witnessed the thrashing, vomiting endgame more than once. But she's starving to death. She circles back, picks up a chunk of suet, swallows it. Then another and one more. It's the day after Christmas, 1923. Kaywood believes she's the last wild wolf born in the state of Colorado. And so you understand that this is not a story that I just made up. After Wild New World came out, a researcher who was looking through the wolf skeletons collected by Biological Survey personnel sent me this. And when I zero in on it, you will see at the bottom the collector is W.H. Kaywood. So my recent book, Wild New World, I endeavored in this book to take seriously the stories of a great many American animals that I really sort of thought had not been taken seriously before, from hummingbirds to woolly mammoths. But among the spectacular bestiary, there was an animal, a sleek golden-eyed animal, who somehow distills so much of the American story. Our destruction of so many ancient species, whether the insights of a new 20th century science could prevail against the religion and the folk wisdom of centuries, even whether the United States was going to be a clone of the nations of Western Europe or do something new. The animal I mean offers a glimpse into this country's soul like no other. That animal is the wolf. So let me expose you for a few minutes before I continue with this story to a controversy that's now raging in science. The evolution of canine predators, dire wolves, gray wolves, red wolves, eastern wolves, coyotes, is presently a lightning rod of unresolved science. The question is, how anciently have wolves been in America? In a widespread genetic investigation published in Nature in 2021, Angela Perry and her co-authors argue that the only purely American wolves in our history were dire wolves, the sole species in a genus they call Anoscion, with fossils here reaching back to the late Miocene 5.7 million years ago. At Rancho La Brea tar pits in California, more than 4,000 of these burly American carnivores died in the asphalt seeps there. And in fact, one of the really striking things you see at La Brea is a wall of dire wolf skulls. A photo I shot the last time I was there. Their remains outnumber gray wolves by more than 100 to 1. 4,000 of them in the tar pits there. In my own recent books, including Wild New World, I've followed a different argument about the origins of wolves. I essentially have followed the work of Ted Bedford and Xiaoming Wang, who did a massive study for the American Museum of Natural History about a decade ago, which rests on the rich fossil record of our wolf-like animals in America. It makes the case for a North American origin for the Canidae family, not just dire wolves, but all the canids, dating back to 5.3 million years ago. In this version, the genus Canis is a leafy evolutionary tree of several different species, many of which are allotaxa. In other words, they're similar enough to one another that they can hybridize. And Canis, in their study, includes Canis dirus, the dire wolf in its original taxonomic classification. But canid hybridization does have a story to tell here in their argument. The American coyote's reluctance to mix with gray wolves, for example, while freely doing so with red and eastern wolves, seems to indicate that there was a time when gray wolves were absent from North America, then returned in several waves during the Pleistocene, starting 30,000 years ago, those waves corresponding to the subspecies that are presently in the United States. That absence of gray wolves from North America, where they had evolved, then gone to Eurasia and then returned, that absence was sufficient to produce behavioral differences between them and indigenous American canids that inhibit their mixing with coyotes in particular. The 2021 Nature article that I just showed you a second ago, though, argues hybridization differently. It uncovered little trace of genetic mixing between dire wolves and members of the family Canidae. And the authors see that as evidence that the Canidae evolved elsewhere than in the Americas, maybe somewhere in the Old World. Here, the many deep-time American fossils that Bedford and Wang studies see as tracking canid evolution, they believe are actually, the new study believes, are actually the remains of regional direwolf populations. In this version, the Canidae again appear in North America in the late Pleistocene, but now they're arriving for the very first time. Whatever its ancient origins, during the great extinction pulse either side of 12,000 years ago, these newly arriving gray wolves, whether they were coming here for the first time or they were returning after an absence of perhaps 1.5 million years, once they got here, though, they outcompeted direwolves, leaving an America with a soup of canis animals, yet no survivors of the direwolf line. Not in Westeros either, by the way. So this is the way the recent wolf story has it. And as I preface this, to me, this is unresolved science. I'm not sure which way it's going to land, but it's an interesting question to take up, whether wolves have been here for 5 million years, briefly left and then returned, or whether they actually evolved in the Old World and arrived here, gray wolves, particularly for the first time 30,000 years ago. In an ancient North America inhabited by native people who never domesticated or herded wild ungulates and who thought of all wolves as kin, teachers, and totem animals, wolves freely got to play their top-of-the-pyramid roles as keystone predators for thousands and thousands of years, shaping continental ecologies down to the birds that sang and the plants that grew. But 400 years ago, the arrival of Old Worlders in numbers at once challenged that ancient algorithm. The Puritan colony in Massachusetts was barely a decade old when, in his New England's prospect, 54-year-old Bostonian William Wood wrote of the wolf as a very special problem for the new colonizers. But wolves were a confusing problem for these Europeans. In America, Wood wrote, "It was never known yet that a wolf ever set upon a man or a woman." That seemed impossible given the folk traditions about wolves in the old world. But wolves in the numbers America held still were unexpected, even if they weren't attacking people. And that led to a certain despair in 1630s New England, since there was, as Wood put it, little hope of their utter destruction. So from the start, the wolf was an animal of special concern for Europeans. But why? Partly there was their lack of familiarity with the real thing. England's own wolves hadn't lasted beyond the 1400s. So Virginians and New Englanders were living among wolves for the first time in their lives, and as Wood implied, they didn't like it in the least. Then there were their imported cultural traditions. When you had herded domesticated animals for 8,000 years, as these old worlders had, and religion was your way of understanding how the world worked, there was a natural tendency to see predators like wolves as a supernatural malediction. For Christians, Adam's fall from the Garden of Eden into an earth compromised by evil struck them as the self-evident origin of wolves. After all, didn't wolves share the yellow eyes medieval illustrations often gave to Satan? The eastern wolves found in northern New England and the red wolves of southern New England, south and west all the way to Texas, were the so-called common devourers that Wood warned about. Some of these wolves were black, a coloring that to Europeans was suspicious in itself. In the 1600s, the explanation for black wolves lay in scientific work 4 centuries in the future, specifically in our own time. A genomic study from a decade ago indicates that black coats in America's wolves sprang from a hybridization event between wolves and domestic dogs in the northwest of the continent approximately 13,000 years back during Clovis times. The mutation conferred a fitness advantage, perhaps in disease resistance, that other wolves sensed. So the visual clue of blackness affected mating choice, allowing black wolves to greet Europeans thousands of years later on the Atlantic shores. While Abenakis and Narragansetts admired wolves for their bravery, hunting skills, and devotion to mates and packs, Europeans saw those very same animals as bloodthirsty monsters, evil actors in a fallen world. Folk stories of werewolves, for example, dim memories of part human, part animal creatures from the Paleolithic, still circulated in colonial times and fed a suspicion that wolves might be avatars of a residual animality in humans. All the folk tales and biblical passages about ravening wolves left some colonists disoriented, though, when America's wolves showed no aggression towards people. But of course, the truth was that didn't matter. The unsuspecting animals were soon to enjoy the full colonial experience. Of course, the reality was that wolf social lives and ecological niches were so similar to our own that it was no accident that tamed wolves had become our first domesticated animals 25,000 years earlier. Wolf societies were much like human hunter-gatherer bands, and both the leadership was usually matriarchal. The alpha female wolf directs a pack's movements, while the larger males, especially those between about 2 and 5 years old, are the primary hunters. Like us, highly social creatures, wolves are members of family packs led by high-status breeders who avoid breeding with close kin. So a pack's grown pups eventually move out in search of mating opportunities. While they are individualists, wolf pups, like young humans, learn from their elders. They are steeped in pack culture. Wolves have strong emotional attachments. After absences, they greet by standing on their hind legs and rallying. They also interact with a remarkable range of body language and facial expressions. Howling, which is contagious for wolves, is one of their common ways to express their emotional states, and it enables them to recognize distant wolves from the harmonic structure of their voices. No one knows how many wolves were in colonial America, but since food determines pup survival, the population of wolves in any given setting rests on food availability. This means the packs compete with one another for prime prey territories. In fact, before Old Worlders arrived, the main mortality in wolves came from other wolves. Europeans imagined America's wolves as vicious slaughterers of helpless prey. In the real world, something different was playing out. Chasing down and neck wrestling big animals armed with hooves and antlers is dangerous in the extreme. Despite their strong jaw muscles, the geometry of wolves' long muzzles actually inhibits their bite force. So like us, they go for low-hanging fruit. Highly perceptive about cost-benefit, they scavenge animals already dead when possible. On the hunt, they try for fawns and young animals or injured, diseased, or old ones. Their strategy is to test prey to see how vulnerable it is, and then they go for the least dangerous and the easiest to run down. Even then, among the white-tailed deer, wolves were primarily hunting in the eastern and southern forests of colonial America. Their chase success could dip as low as 10%. This wolf natural history was invisible to colonists because all the new settlers really cared about was fashioning a wolf-free America. Wood's Massachusetts Bay Colony, in fact, passed the first wildlife law ever passed in American history. You could guess it, it was a bounty on the continent's wolves. John James Audubon left us in the future a chilling account of how wolves experienced this colonial war on them. This was in 1814 when the attitudes of Americans toward wolves had hardened into a rare viciousness. Spending the night with a farmer on the Vincennes Trace, Audubon accompanied his host to a capture pit that held 3 wolves. The wolves' sin, they had attacked the farmer's loose stock in a country by then bled of almost all its deer, bison, and elk. Climbing into the pit, the farmer one by one severed the wolves' hamstrings with a penknife, exhibiting as little fear as if he had been marking lambs, Audubon wrote. Then he dragged the wolves out so his dogs could tear them to pieces. Audubon wrote that he helped the farmer pull up the largest, a black male wolf in the prime of life. The naturalist described this beast of old world horror stories as motionless with fright as if dead, its disabled legs swinging to and fro, its jaws wide open, and the gurgle in its throat alone indicating that it was still alive. Petrified with fear, the black wolf offered no resistance. It took the dogs less than a minute, Audubon said, to stop the gurgling and extinguish his life. Over the ensuing centuries, Americans who came to see the continent's wild animals as little more than commodity body parts for a market economy engaged in many an unspeakable act of slaughter against everything from passenger pigeons to some of the largest, most charismatic herd animals in the world. But wolves came in for a particular cruelty. Hardly anyone remembers now that there was once a viable rural occupation known as wolfer. When strychnine became cheaply available in America in 1834, with naturally no restrictions at all on its use, poisons offered a new way to make money off nature. Unlike trapping or shooting, poison didn't even require any skill. You just baited a carcass and then headed to camp to enjoy life while strychnine did its work. Approaching a carcass they had baited wolfers would start finding victims a quarter mile from the bayed animal, their corpses appearing sprayed across the landscape as if by some spinning centrifuge. The poison killed through asphyxiation, a death preceded by convulsive cramping so violent it almost twisted an animal to death. In the process, wolfers, of course, kill thousands of eagles, ravens, magpies, coyotes, and foxes as collateral damage. As with so many other animals, there was money to be made, since wolf pelts sometimes served as $1 currency on the frontier. But accepted wisdom was that wolfers were doing their part for civilization by protecting livestock interests. From 1883 on until 1928, the territory and state of Montana had governments that often spent 2/3 of their annual budgets paying bounties on wolves. By 1928, the one state of Montana had paid for the deaths of 111,545 gray wolves. Don't misunderstand, though, wildlife exploitation to underwrite the American economy didn't just focus on wolves. By 1886, market capitalism had reduced 30 million bison to a pathetic 1,000. That same year, a scientist named Frank Chapman, strolling the Upper East Side of Manhattan, counted 542 New York women wearing hats adorned with the feathers of some 160 different species of wild American birds. Over 1 year in the 1880s, 1 year, the breeding plumes of 193,000 American egrets and herons killed in their nesting rookeries by southern market hunters went on sale in London's commercial sale rooms. In just 1 week, in the year 1886, the skins of 400,000 American hummingbirds found buyers in those same rooms. In the American West, a region so teeming with wildlife that it was our version of a Serengeti. In that Serengeti by 1900, there was very little, if any, wildlife left. How could that have possibly been? Here's how. In a single year in the 1870s, market hunters in Bozeman shipped east the skins of 7,700 elk, 22,000 deer, 12,000 pronghorns, 200 bighorn sheep, then followed that with pelts from 1,680 wolves, 520 coyotes, and 225 bears, most of them grizzlies. It was a haul in wild animal parks that netted them $60,000, about $1.6 million today. That was the work of 1 year out of one town in the West. And birds of passage, as late as the 1880s, passenger pigeons were still trying to nest in Midwestern states like Wisconsin and Michigan. But vast nestings like the one in Sparta, Wisconsin in the 1870s, a nesting that had covered 850 square miles, were winking into oblivion. 100,000 market hunters descended on one of the last Midwestern nestings, and as one observer put it, the slaughter was terrible beyond any description I have ever seen or read. The scene was truly pitiable. By 1902, wild pigeons were gone in America. The last passenger pigeon, as you know, died in captivity in 1914, named for the wife of the first president of the United States, Martha. Having thrived on this continent for 15 million years, in multiple billions of birds, somehow passenger pigeons were unable to survive a mere 3 centuries of our presence. And this will give you an idea of more of the birds we lost. The great auk, our northern hemisphere penguin, which was gone by the 1840s. The Carolina parakeet, our probably most colorful and beautiful bird. And there was a western subspecies, by the way, that ranged all the way to Colorado. And, of course, the ivory-billed woodpecker. In this ability to kill animals en masse, Americans, frankly, were unmatched in the world. I have written in 2 of my books, both American Serengeti and Wild New World, that in my research on those books, I was unable to discover anything that rivaled America's destruction of wildlife anywhere else in the modern world. I mean, we stand alone in having done this. On the other hand, in Yellowstone today, we got to see a whole diverse range of species that we managed to save, some at the very brink of extinction, like bison, for instance, and wolves. But something happened somewhere in our history that turned this story around, because in the late 19th century, we were bound for the oblivion of many of our most charismatic species, at least if it was possible to make money off of them. By the early 20th century, a new institutional player emerged to confront wolves and other predators in the United States. Before 1905, it seemed that C. Hart Merriam's new Bureau of Biological Survey, created initially to map the wildlife that was left in post-frontier America, was sitting pretty. Teddy Roosevelt was president, and the Bureau was dear to his heart. But Congress was growing testy about funding an agency interested in pure science. At Livestock Association meetings, Western ranchers were arguing that the vast Western public lands Roosevelt had set aside from homesteading were refuges for predators that attacked their stock. Since the Fed had created this situation, the ranchers believed the Fed ought to fix it. So in an act of self-preservation, the Bureau of Biological Survey remade itself into the solution to the country's predator problem. Between 1907 and 1909, it issued 4 reports on the so-called predator-big game livestock relationship in and around the brand new national forests. A young, poorly educated Minnesotan named Vernon Bailey, who was a whiz at trapping animals, authored most of these reports. An agency like the Bureau, his reports claim, could bring orderly and scientific control to wolf destruction by hiring trained hunters and trappers like Bill Kaywood. Bailey held seminars for national forest managers, teaching them how to find wolf dens and the best strategies for destroying pups and packs. Forest Service rangers proceeded to kill 1,800 wolves and 23,000 coyotes in the national forest within a year. Teddy Roosevelt was so impressed that hereafter he referred to Bailey by a nickname, Wolf Bailey. In 20th century America, there was literally no opposition to this campaign of annihilation. America's beloved nature writer John Burroughs opined that predators certainly needed killing, since, as he put it, the fewer of these there are, the better for the useful and beautiful game. Wildlife activist William Temple Hornaday insisted that firearms, dogs, traps, strychnine are thoroughly legitimate weapons of destruction. No halfway measures will suffice. Not even John Muir spoke out, although Muir did worry that slaughtering wolves might induce what he called a penalty for interfering with the balance of nature. There was another constituency for the war on predators, too. Destroying wolves would produce all the deer and elk America's new sport hunters could ever want. And of course, while we were wiping out so many other creatures, we did want to keep the animals that we wanted to hunt. And so this emerged as a new constituency. Nobody asked the sport hunters whether they would focus on the same animals in an elk herd that wolves did, because, of course, at the time, no one knew anything about wolf-prey relationships. but advocating replacing predators with human hunters was a stroke of genius, bringing all manner of sportsmen's groups, firearms manufacturers, and state game and fish agencies to the cause of wiping out every wolf on the continent. Without conducting a single research project on the wolf's role in nature, the Biological Survey engineered massive public support for wolf extermination. And in 1914, Congress approved an appropriation of $125,000 to launch the war. Within 2 years, the Bureau had hired 300 federal hunters and had them in the field. Under Miriam's leadership, the Biological Survey was now a critical federal agency on behalf of American civilization, and that's how they framed it. The act of making America over in the image of Western European countries that had long ago destroyed their own predators. The one field of 20th century wildlife science in which Americans became acknowledged global leaders, in fact, was in the destruction of so-called undesirable species, something that we exported around the globe. So if your assignment was to mass kill wolves, the way to go about it was poisoning entire populations. And you did that by strewing poison baits by the thousands across the American landscape. As for the target animal, the campaign brooked no mercy or compassion whatsoever. At one point, Vernon Bailey inquired of his boss about the proper dose of strychnine so a poisoned wolf might die within a humane 3 minutes. Knowing full well that any expression of mercy towards wolves was a political liability, Miriam shot back, "You had better go at once to the hospital in Albuquerque, inasmuch as no sane man could possibly make such an absurd and utterly preposterous statement as this. You are obviously in need of mental treatment." Miriam closed his letter this way: "We want the cattleman behind us, sabe?" With its new funding, the Bureau commenced building a plant in Albuquerque to produce strychnine baits in volume. Chillingly, they called it the Eradication Methods Lab. By 1921, this federal killing agency was in Denver, in which location it eventually perfected an amazing witch's brew of ever deadlier pesticides. But for the next 2 decades, federal poisoners relied on strychnine. It was potent, twisting wolves into what was known as the strychnine signature, their bodies wrenched and their tails shocked straight out as if they'd been struck by a bolt of lightning. Federal hunters also grasped the wolf's fatal flaw. The smaller American canids, coyotes, had evolved an adaptation called fission fusion, living in social groups when possible, fusion, but capable of scattering into individuals and pairs and colonizing new territories when ecological pressures call for it. Fission. But wolves are so strongly family-based that wolf killers realized that taking out one animal meant, as one Bureau hunter put it, you can quickly kill all the members of whole families of wolves with unmistakable evidence that the remaining members of the wolf family have been seeking the lost member. At this fecund moment, 2 new developments were about to alter the arc of this story. In 1915, scientific naturalists founded the Ecological Society of America. And at their first meeting in Philadelphia, the founding members, Frederick Clements and Edith Clements, Charles C. Adams, and Victor Shelford, agreed on a focus for their new discipline. There was adaptation and natural selection, classic Darwinian fields, of course, along with investigating the flow of energy through nature and an analysis of seral stages and what Clements called climax conditions. Shelford, who had just published his landmark Animal Communities in Temperate America, pushed his colleagues to work on what he called biotic communities as well. In 1915, this society counted 307 members. But it was an old-fashioned topic, an idea Western culture had known since the time of Herodotus and Plato as the balance of nature that pushed ecology towards rethinking the role of predators. The Biological Survey's policies had assumed the European folk position. Predators are evil, they're disposable, and civilization follows their eradication. The ecologists, though, believe there might instead be some sort of dynamic equilibria at work in the natural world. That assumption would become the crux of a raging battle in American and Western science for the next 50 years. So let me tell you a little bit about it. The other development of the moment was Americans' creation of the National Park Service in 1916. Initially, Yellowstone, the world's first national park, had emerged as a symbol of just how far the wolf warriors intended to go. In 1914, Yellowstone had invited Vernon Bailey to come and show its personnel the best techniques to exterminate wolves. Yellowstone's tally till the death of the last gray wolf in the park, that happened in the year 1926, was 136 wolves, 80 of which were puppies. Between 1918 and 1935, the world's first grand wildlife park issued a death sentence to 2,968 coyotes as well. All the while, the Eradication Methods Lab was cranking out the strychnine until by the mid-1920s, Bureau hunters had distributed an astounding 3.5 million poison baits across the American landscape. Yet amid the wolf endgame in America, evidence of Darwinian natural selection and a wolf culture of survivability began to emerge. Stanley Young, a hunter who would rise through the ranks at the Bureau, believed of these last wolves that, as he put it, it is probable that never did more intelligent wolves exist in the world. Like 18th century sperm whales that famously figured out how to avoid whaling boats and harpooners, these last wolves, like Rags and Greenhorn, drew on the accumulated learning of scores of wolf generations. What seemed initially to be a natural ally mounted the first real challenge to the Bureau's scorched earth wolf war. The American Society of Mammalogists met for the first time at the Smithsonian in 1919. Bureau founder C. Hart Merriam became its first president, with Vernon Bailey and his Bureau mate E.A. Goldman as charter members. Like Bailey, Goldman had field experience, but he lacked a college education. Nonetheless, the Bureau tasked these two to explain and defend the wolf war against university-trained ecologists. Among that group was a young forester interested in wildlife, Aldo Leopold. There was also Joseph Grinnell, a cousin of the legendary conservation hero George Bird Grinnell. Joseph Grinnell was an original thinker whose ideas quickly challenged the very premises on which the Bureau based its predator war. The first blow-up happened at the 1924 meeting. Grinnell had just published a foundational piece on ecological niches, a fundamental insight into nature critical to appreciating what might happen if America destroyed its wolf populations. Grinnell and his graduate student, E. Raymond Hall, insisted from this work on niches that the Bureau was wiping out animals that were essential in the continent's balance of nature. As it turned out, both the ecologist and the Bureau men were unaware that the natural world was about to offer up powerful examples of the implications of emptying America's predator niches. But Goldman and Bailey decided that they had heard about the balance of nature a few too many times. If the U.S. actually let predators live, they argued at this 1924 meeting, it was self-evident that there would soon be nothing but carnivores left in America. In a throwdown essay, The Predatory Mammal Problem and the Balance of Nature that Goldman authored for the Journal of Mammalogy, he insisted that the coming of civilized man meant that the balance of nature has been violently overturned on this continent, never to be reestablished. Thus, as he put it, large predatory mammals, destructive to game and to livestock, no longer have a place in our advancing civilization. But Joseph Grinnell had come up with another idea, and this one vexed the Bureau as much as niches and the balance of nature. Now there was a National Park Service with an organic act charging it with preserving nature for future generations. But how? Grinnell and zoologist Tracy Storer had a suggestion they laid out in an article for the journal Science. In their opinion, preserving nature meant, as they put it, predaceous animals should be left unmolested and allowed to retain their primitive relation to the rest of the fauna. As tourists were already showing, wolves, coyotes, and lions were exceedingly interesting to park visitors. Wasn't a complete nature what preserving nature in the parks intended? Offering predators permanent refuge in America's national parks dumbfounded Bureau personnel. New Bureau Director Paul Reddington was incredulous. "We face the opposition," he told his employees, "of those who want to see the mountain lion, the wolf, the coyote, and the bobcat actually perpetuated as part of the wildlife of this country." One of the scientists keenly interested in this debate had published an essay he called "The Varmint Question," heaping praise on the Bureau when he was just out of Yale. Aldo Leopold was not a vocal critic of the Bureau as the wolf debate began to roil science. But as conference chairman at the American Game Protection Association's meeting in 1928, Leopold's position about predators, he revealed, was obviously evolving. "No public agency," he wrote, "should ever control predators without substantial scientific research first. Poisons should only be used in emergencies. And, as he wrote, no predatory species should be exterminated over large areas of this country." Now, as professor of game management at the University of Wisconsin, Leopold dropped more deeply into ecology, the field that worried critics were already calling the subversive science. One of the issues he particularly studied was the response of nature to predator removal. The 1920s witnessed the rise of a new meme to describe a new natural phenomenon. The meme word was eruption, and it referred to a sudden ungulate population explosion that caused herds to eat themselves out of forage and then crash. The cause-effect seemed straightforward. The famous Kaibab eruption was preceded by Bureau hunters erasing 30 gray wolves, 781 mountain lions, and 5,000 coyotes from the Grand Canyon's north rim. The resident mule deer then exploded from 4,000 animals to 100,000, leading to a catastrophic die-off. It made Kaibab a national story. Eruptions became a moral that just wouldn't go away. With wolves vanishing, deer and elk experienced crazy population oscillations somewhere in the country almost every year. Something in nature obviously was amiss. Leopold decided he would do a study of eruptions and found reports of only 2 of them before 1900, but a whopping 42 between 1900 and 1945, the number rising sharply after 1920. Eruptions seem to supply evidence for the so-called Lotka-Volterra equations, ecological models of how prey and their predators follow an oscillating algorithm of rising and falling populations. But the inertia of the wolf war was now an unstoppable undertow in America. The Bureau's response was to go to the American public with a series of canned newspaper articles akin to those lauding the G-men hunting down crime celebrities like Al Capone and John Dillinger, except in this instance, it's U.S. agents stalked the desperados of the animal world. These stories appeared all over the country. This one is from the Denver Post, but I saw one when I was doing research on this that was in the Washington Post. There still had been no science, amazingly, to study the larger role of wolves in American nature. But by the 1940s, that was finally about to change. The two Minnesota brothers, Olaus and Adolph Murray, were soon to become legendary figures in American conservation. Having done landmark studies on elk in Jackson Hole and on the porcupine caribou herd in Alaska, Olaus would conduct a game-changing study of coyotes in Jackson Hole, which appeared in print in 1935. Brother Adolph Murray's own Ecology of the Coyote in the Yellowstone saw print in 1940. Both works concluded that far from being arch predators, as the Bureau had been calling them since the 1920s, animals that deserved extermination, coyotes produced actions in the world that were virtually all either beneficial to humans or at least neutral. The Murray brothers would become famous in science as ethical researchers who followed their evidence. Ultimately, for the Bureau, now renamed the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Murray brothers' work did not lead to the conclusions it hoped for wolves either. By 1940, Mount McKinley in Alaska was the only American park that still had wolves. After centuries of unexamined wolf killing, perhaps it was actually time to figure out something about wolf ecology. So in 1939, Murray went to Alaska and spent 3 years engaged in the unthinkable, actually studying wolves interacting among themselves with other predators and with their prey. It was arduous, Murray said. He walked 1,700 miles the first year he was at Mount McKinley Park. But everybody who reads his classic, The Wolves of Mount McKinley, can't help but thrill to his excitement at studying the mythic animal Americans had reflexively tried to exterminate from the beginning of this country. After 3 years in Alaska, Murray understood what the Bureau had been too arrogant or myopic to see. Wolf-prey relationships clearly were ancient, predating Europeans by thousands, maybe millions of years. Nobody knew, but Murray was convinced they were really deep in time. Natural selection had long since sorted out the details. Yes, wolves and coyotes ate pronghorn fawns. So pronghorns had evolved a solution. They gave birth to twins, an heir and a spare. Yes, wolves preyed on Dall sheep and caribou, but they caught the very young and the very old. Wolves held sheep numbers in check, Murray believed, and kept them from overgrazing their mountains. Rather than destroying their prey, wolf predation probably has a salutary effect on the sheep as a species, Murray wrote. Wolves did kill caribou calves, but as he studied the relationship, Murray realized the caribou herds are no doubt adjusted to the presence and pressure of the wolf and have long been so. These things were ancient. They predated not just Europeans, but very likely all human experience in America. Murray did one other thing that readers of his book never forgot. He brought the wolves he studied to life as individuals. Dandy, Robber Mask, and Grandpa had unique personalities. Pack members seemed affectionate and caring of one another, he wrote. They were not the wolves old worlders had feared from the animus that they had brought ashore. They weren't the wolves the Bureau's public relations articles implied were animal gangsters. They were the wolves that had been in North America all along. The wolves of Mount McKinley was the country's first entree into a modern sensibility about wolves and predators generally. And once the blindfold was off, it was hard for the scientifically literate ever to put it on again. At almost the same time Urey's book came out, old Bureau veterans Stanley Young and E.A. Goldman finally published their 2-volume The Wolves of North America. They proudly pointed out that from New England to Virginia, wolves were now entirely erased. The Rocky Mountain states, with all their public lands, barely held 100 wolves by the end of World War II. California's last wolves were down to fewer than 50. There were only 60 Mexican wolves left in the Southwest. As the war ended, the only places in the lower 48 that still had populations of wolves were the upper Great Lakes country and the Mid-South, where a few red wolves still prevailed. Young and Goldman were unrepentant wolf killers. They laid out their book like it was a military campaign against Germany or Japan, full of accounts of wolf depredations, photos of wolf kill stock, claims that game was disappearing because of wolves. There was dismay that stock-raising Hispanic settlers in the Southwest and California had somehow never attempted predator control, since the authors argued in their book that wolves had slowed Anglo-American settlement of the continent down by decades. The one atrocity they couldn't levy against American wolves, though, were attacks on humans. Not that they didn't look hard for some examples, they just couldn't find anything. In a case of future meet past, Aldo Leopold reviewed The Wolves of North America in 1945. How could it be, he wondered, that Young and Goldman didn't acknowledge the deep history of their subject? If wolves were as destructive a force as they implied, why had the wolf failed to wipe out its own mammalian food supply, as Leopold put it, before Europeans ever arrived? Leopold had visited Europe, and he'd studied the wildlife policies there, and he knew the Bureau men never questioned the old world model. But European countries had nothing comparable to the vast wild public lands Americans had set aside. And their model, Leopold knew, was based on folk tradition, established long before ecology was born, that simply was not, as Leopold put it, scientific. The New Wolf book reflected, as Leopold wrote, the naturalists of the past rather than the wildlife ecologists of today. Ouch. In 1949, America's star biologist finally published a book that would set the country on its modern path of wolf recovery and restoration, and make it possible for those of us who went to the park today to actually see wolves. Leopold's A Sand County Almanac became both a bestseller and a philosophical foundation for the ecology movement sweeping America as part of the 60s Cultural Revolution. We're damned lucky he got it out. He died of a heart attack battling a grass fire that year, because A Sand County Almanac changed the world. In vivid poetic passages, Leopold's book introduced us to the insights of a mind that had tracked every breakthrough in ecology. By then, he had concluded that the old balance of nature idea probably lacked the flexibility to account for a natural world that was endlessly changing. He was now thinking of natural settings as interlinked communities of species with predators at the top. We know these communities today as ecosystems. Leopold's ideas were epiphanies for many. For one, he laid out an ecological philosophy for living he called the land ethic that included his golden rule of ecology. A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It's wrong when it tends otherwise. The genius that built the United States, he knew, had always been self-interest. Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill had hit on a trait fundamental to human evolution. But Leopold did not say in his book that an act was right when it preserved humanity or human economics. Instead, he called on readers to think of the innate rights, among them the simple right to exist in the world, of other species in an earthly community that included us. Leopold's admirers called his new idea biocentrism. A Sand County Almanac's most unforgettable scene was Leopold's own myth of personal redemption. The chapter titled Thinking Like a Mountain was not merely a poetic rendering of his view that the United States had an opportunity to create a distinctively American policy towards nature. For readers soon to be immersed in painful soul-searching about so many unexamined assumptions in American life, Leopold's story of shooting a wolf as a young man, watching the green fire die in its eyes, and realizing what a miscalculation he had made about the ancient centrality of predators in the biotic community, offered America a whole new destination. We were wrong. I was wrong, his story said. But it's not too late. Aldo Leopold didn't get to see the country begin to think like a mountain. But he had pointed us towards a new destination in our history, where under a remarkable Endangered Species Act, we would try to recover species, including wolves, for all eternity. Thank you for listening to this. I appreciate it. I know it's long.